Hello and welcome to episode 110 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and this month we have something slightly different. Or rather, we have two slightly different things. A couple of weeks ago, I was approached by Lance Dong of the San Diego chapter of the Alfa Romeo Owners Club of the USA. I first met Lance on a Zoom call when AROC UK and AROC USA were exchanging ideas for keeping members entertained during COVID lockdowns. One of the things we just started was this podcast, and Lance has been a listener ever since. But far more than that, he's also started his own podcast called Always Looking for Another. Lance asked me if he could interview me for his show, which he did, and I then turned the tables on him and interviewed him back. You can find episode 13 of Always Looking for Another on Spotify, Podcast Addict, Buzzsprout, and everywhere else good podcasts are found. You don't have to listen to that episode first, but if you have time, I recommend you do. We refer to it a couple of times here. But this should all make perfect sense even if you listen to this one first. And I'd recommend downloading the other 12 episodes too. As we had on Lance's show, we started with origin stories. What's your car background? How did you get into cars in the first place?
I've done a lot of thinking about this, but then I think I inherited the car gene from my father because growing up, I really didn't think about it that much. But in hindsight, of course, you think about those times where you spend with him or cars came up and then I think back through it. The first time I really became aware of his interest in cars, I was in high school, and there was an English composition that I just couldn't get started. I had blank paper syndrome. He came in and we started I was saying, well, I really don't know what I can talk about, what I can write about. So he said, well, let's chat about what are you interested in? What do you like? And the subject of cars and automobiles came up. And he was born in 1901. I was a very late child. So he saw the evolution of all of the technology that we take for granted, and especially cars. And he told me about the time that he had to rebuild the transmission on his Model T. And then I looked at some of the other cars that he's owned, and while they were mostly American cars, they were not run-of-the-mill cars. And I found out that he had, post-war, he had actually ordered a Tucker and had received some of the accessories along with his order. And then, of course, Tucker was put out of business and he never received the car. And then some of the earlier memories of cars as a child were toy cars. I have some distinct memories of him coming back from trips to Europe, and he brought some of the Schuko wind-up cars. And I remember playing with those on the dining room table. And then as I grew up, there was more and more toy cars. And I just kept playing with those. And he was a physician. And in 57, one other memory, I was born in 51. And in 55, he went to Germany or to Austria to do some postgraduate surgical work, and was wanting to buy a new car. And in 55, 56, he was looking at a 300 SL. My mother said, no, it doesn't have a back seat. Where are we going to put Lance? It's like, well, okay. So in 57,
had a trunk.
57, he came back with the first 356 Porsche. I remember the car. I don't remember a lot about it, but I do remember we did take a road trip from Central California, where we lived, all the way to Vancouver, British Columbia. Visited some friends of his, and then
I was going to ask you which Vancouver, because there's quite a few between California and British Columbia.
Yeah, he had some Chinese they were Chinese expatriates at the time that settled in Vancouver. So we drove up there. He was an avid golfer, and he had strapped his golf clubs to the front of the Porsche. And then, of course, the right side of the car and the minimal trunk had all of our luggage in it, all the way up and back. That was a memorable trip. And then in 63, he did it again and came back with the 356B, which then became my first car when I was a senior in high school. And I remember sitting in the garage before I had my license, but I'd sit in the garage and try to figure out, the right hand, left foot, how do we do that? And I enjoyed going with him, on trips and drives and learning all about, on those cars, your signal light on the 350 on the B was in the center of the horn. So the horn was on the outside and the signal light was on the center. And I remember my second oldest brother who bought a Giulietta Spider from another cousin. And that was my first introduction to Alfas. But they got into a friendly argument as to who was supposed to signal first, the Alfa or the Porsche. And then it just became, well, whoever sees the other first. My brother said, no, the Alfa is supposed to signal first. The Porsche is supposed to answer. But anyway, I just was enthralled with cars of all kinds. I owned several throughout my adult years until 87 when I bought my first Alfa, and it was an 82 GTV6. So my first car memory was pretty much playing with these toy cars. My dad was my major influences, but Alfas, I don't know. It was just, I saw an ad for the 81 Alfa Romeo, the GTV6. And it just kind of struck me because it compared the GTV6 with the Ferrari 308 GTB, which had come out at the same time. And they said, well, why would you want to pay $10,000 more? I don't know, what it was, 15 horsepower more for the 308. And that kind of struck me. And then 5 years later, I had the opportunity to buy an 82. And I said, we needed a car. I said, that's the one I want. And from then on, it was just, I will never not have an Alfa in my life.
I've had a Ferrari thread too. I remember as a teenager going to a country fair locally, and they had lots of businesses showing their wares. And one of them was a local Ferrari dealer. And there were two guys tuning a 512 BB carbureted version, tuning it by ear with the two of them walking around all of these twin pack Webers trying to get it to go well. And the 308, obviously, Magnum was the reason everybody wanted a 308, although I wanted a GTB, not a GTS. But I remember when I got my 147 GTA, just looking at the figures and saying, you know what, 0 to 60 and top speed and everything else on my 147 is almost exactly the same as that 308 was just 15 years earlier, 10, 15 years earlier.
But, I was just going to say that, I mean, the styling of the 308 also was so different and striking for the time. And even still, I mean, the curves of the design just stood out and continues.
Yeah. And you can still see that line all the way through, certainly as far as the 360. I think it gets a bit lost after the 360, but
yeah,
all the way through that series, you can see the heritage. So that GTV6 was your first Alfa.
Yes.
I know you've got a GTV6 now. Is that the same one, or have we moved on since then?
Sadly, no. I mean, the first one was a standard, I guess. Over here, almost all of the 81s and 82s were silver gray with blue interior and very little options. I drove that one for probably 5 years. It was early in my Alfa ownership, and I didn't fully understand what the maintenance really should be, to really take care of it well. So I kind of destroyed the first engine. Fortunately, I was into the club at the time, and I had some very good friends who were very mechanically inclined, a couple, and they had been collecting Alfas and other types of cars, and had a 2.5 liter engine out of a Milano just sitting in their garage waiting for a project. So they took
as
pity
Alfa owners do.
Yes, exactly. And they took pity on me and said, well, we have this and we were looking for a project and this looks like a perfect project. If you're willing to get your hands dirty and put in some sweat equity, you can help us rebuild this and put it into your car, and we could keep your car running. So, over a period of probably 6 weeks to 2 months, I was over there every spare day, cleaning it up, getting all the grime off. We got to grinding the valves, and he showed me all about the timing chain and all of the rest of that. And I drove that car until 1995, when I took my first vacation and left it with my local mechanic. I said, I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. Let's go ahead and do some of the maintenance things that we want to do. I came back and he said, I have to admit that he had parked it underneath, he had a 4-post lift, but he had parked it under a Giulietta that had a brake leak. It dropped brake fluid onto the paint of the car, but he knew the history of my car and that it was not really very special, had a couple front end collisions. And he said, well, I have this 82 Bolocco, whose engine is no good, but the body and the rest of the car is very good. He said, I'll work you a deal. We'll take your engine and transaxle and put it into this new one. And I wound up with the number 110 of 350, the Bolocco, and I still have that car today.
Okay. With the original 75 Milano engine in it.
Correct. And that engine has been rebuilt. Well, the top end was rebuilt probably twice. Second time, it turned out there was a bad bearing and it started going. But my mechanic at that time heard it and he said, we need to fix that. So we did that, and he also reground the cams, and it's mechanically is great. I need to have the body redone, and some of the electricals are going. I'm having to replace the cooling fan on that also, which I found a set of replacement fans from a mention in Alpha BB, and I got them from Alex Jupe in the UK, and I'm really impressed with the engineering and the workmanship on that. And I'm hoping to get that back on the road very soon.
But Alex is our Alfetta and GTV registrar in the club. So
excellent.
So that's the thread through to that GTV6. Is that the only Alfa that you've had, or have you had others?
Oh, no. When I had the silver gray one, as I had mentioned, I had a couple of front end collisions with it. Most of them not my fault. Well, I had two. Both of them were not my fault, but it damaged the front end. So I had it in the shop for a while, and I needed a second car to get to work. So another member said, well, I have an Alfetta sedan that I want to get rid of. It was a 77. It had a really funky gold paint job on it, but it was really nice running. It was a 2-liter, but they had put a 1750 cams in it. So it ran really well. I drove that for 2 years every day, and then sold that for $50 more than I bought it for. And then I was talking to my mechanic in the early 90s, was thinking about getting a motorcycle, like a BMW R100 or something like that. I'd gotten a good job, my first full-time IT job, and I was making relatively good money. So I was talking to him because he was into motorcycles as well. He said, well, before you go to do that, why don't you take this Spider I have here? I'm trying to sell it for a gentleman who is moving back to Switzerland. This was his San Diego car, and drive it around for the weekend and let me know what you think. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And I mean, as history tells it, nothing was better than driving a Spider with a top downer in San Diego. So drove that one for a year, and then another good friend of mine, the wife of the couple that helped me rebuild the engine, they had separated, but she had an 86 Spider Quadrifoglio that was very well sorted. And she said, well, I'm going to move on to something else. Do you want this one? I said, absolutely. So I sold the 82 and bought the 86. And I owned that one for another 3 years. And I took my wife on our first date in the GTV6. And then 2 years later, we needed to buy her a car. So we got a 164 from another club member, and that was her car for a number of years until the interior parts started falling apart.
They did that?
Yeah, unfortunately. And the engine was great. She loved that car. She would like to tell the story. She would troll Porsches on the freeway where they'd pull up alongside her, and she'd look over at them and just put her foot down and take off from, and they're thinking, what
is
what
that?
happened?
Yeah.
So we sold that to my mechanic and took the credit for working on my GTV6. But that's the last Alfa. I'm kind of jonesing for one now, but at some point probably I'll get the one I really would like to get when the prices come down is a Giulia Quad in the Verde Montreal. I've just been very struck by that color.
That's the color of my Tonale. That was the only spec choice I made before I went looking for a car was any spec as long as it's Montreal green. It's funny you asked me on your podcast about my dream car, and I said a 105 1300 GTA Junior, which absolutely is. My realistic one is probably I'd love a Duetto Series 1 Spider, but a nice Series 4 Spider is probably my attainable dream car. So to turn that question around, what's your dream Alfa?
Oh, well, of course. Well, up to about 3 or 4 years ago, it was the Tipo 33. I'd also had dreams about a 2900B, one of those spiders. I've seen a number of them, and it's like, oh, just to own one would be the thing. Of course, maintaining it and driving it is completely different. And to me, to own an Alfa, you have to drive it. You really I would want to always drive an Alfa of some sort. So I turned that around, and then it's now an 8C Competizione Spider. I've always had a soft spot for spiders. I just love the drop top, or in American cars, the T-tops. I've had a couple of those. I had a 914-6, which I drove around with the top off for a number of years. So my unobtainium car would be the 8C Spider.
I got a call on Monday. Our podcast came out. We'd been talking about the Giulia 10th anniversary. Mm-hmm. And I had a call from a club member who I know quite well. It's actually a Kiwi. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. And I knew him through him having the first Giulia GTAM that arrived in the UK. And so he has a red GTAM with a tricolore stripe on it. Didn't go for the race numbers, but does have the stripe. And he has his car collection in an industrial unit not far from where I live. And about 2 years ago, he said, if you've ever got the chance, come down and see the collection. And he emailed me on Monday, said, just listen to the podcast. I'm in the unit. Do you want to come down and have a chat? So I popped down there. So given the cars that we talked about when I was on your podcast, in his unit, there was the GTAM, there was a white 8C Competizione Spider, which he bought when he didn't get a 33 Stradale, the new one, a 4C, and then parked outside was his 147 GTA, which I think he's had from new. So that was kind of me almost in my dream garage, but unfortunately it was somebody else's garage.
I'm not sure, but I think I've seen a picture of that.
Yeah, it's been on the front cover of our magazine, and it's
when you described he had two 8Cs.
One 8C and one GTAM. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think I've seen a picture.
Two 8Cs, I think, would be greedy. But he has, we have this really strange license plate system where you can only have certain combinations, but you can go back and get versions from years ago as reissued plates. So his license plate is ARE5E, which is spaced so it looks like it says Aracy. Just for the benefit of our readers, tell us a bit about the US Club and how you're organized and some of the things you get up to.
Yeah, the US Club has probably 4,000 to 5,000 members from California to New England. Of course, the major metropolitan areas have the largest concentrations, basically in the four corners, because Florida has probably 5 chapters. Southern California, we have, San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara. So we have five in the Southern California area, 1 in all of Northern California, and then Portland and Northwest in Seattle is a large concentration as well, but smaller chapters spread across all of the United States. We have a central board of directors. We meet monthly online. Each of the local chapters is an independent chapter chartered within its own region. So we all operate together. We try to cooperate with each other. Each area has their own specialty of interest. Los Angeles, since we had a number of racetracks in the LA area, they had a very high interest, and a large portion of their membership were track focused. A number of the other areas are more social or car show concours type gatherings. San Diego, which is my chapter, we tend to do social events and shorter weekend drives. So as you go across the U.S., you'll find probably more socialization unless there are tracks nearby. And then Chicago has a fair number of tracks in their local area. So they'll have a lot of track focus as well.
I just, again, for the benefit of UK viewers, these are tracks with right turns as well as left turns.
Correct. Yeah, mostly, almost all of them are road courses.
Yeah.
We don't have too many oval track racers. Although in the last convention we had in North Carolina, the track event was at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is a giant 2.5 mile oval. But they have in the midfield they have a road track as well. So it was interesting because track day then was a rainy morning. So when the cars went out, they had to be very careful in their high speed runs because the track was wet for a while. And the report back was from some of them. It's like it was really wild driving at high speed with all the water.
And I guess the water comes down off the oval track into the center as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had a time because they on the pre-convention tour. They had 3 days of tours in the Smoky Mountains in western North Carolina and Tennessee. There's a road there called Tail of the Dragon, which is a sort of a mythical road for a lot of people who like those types of roads. So I didn't get to go on that one, but I was looking forward to it. But then I heard later that, California's got better roads than that. So I took with a few grains of salt.
Again, we mentioned it on your podcast, but the Brit who was over at the UK embassy in Washington, I've got a couple of photo shoots that he did on the Tail of the Dragon in his 147 GTA. So certainly spectacular, particularly in the fall.
Yes. Great scenery. Unfortunately, from what I hear, it's so popular now that it's very difficult to drive it. But because of the curves, there are a lot of motorcycle accidents also. So now it's more of a tour than an exciting road.
So as we've got onto that subject, what are your favorite roads for driving the Alfa on?
Locally, there are a number of shorter roads, shorter in the respect that there may be a 2-hour road from the coast up to the local mountains. And then one can take a right turn and go through some of the mountain towns and then back down to the coast, or take a left turn, head out more toward the desert with open spaces and sweeping curves, and then back down to the coastline, or longer drives from Southern California to Northern California. The parts of it is the Pacific Coast Highway, also known as Highway 1, from north of Los Angeles all the way through Big Sur to Monterey, and then across the Monterey Bay from north of San Francisco all the way up to the Oregon border. Those are incomparable drives. 2 to 3 days of driving and sightseeing is just, it doesn't really matter how fast you drive it. And you really can't drive it very fast anyway because of the curves, but the scenery is just spectacular. So you pull over and you just admire the view, take pictures, the redwoods or the elephant seals on the beach is just fabulous drives.
Yeah, I've done the San Francisco to about Carmel, which is amazing. And the mountain road that I've done not that far away from you, which was part of one of my other obsessions, was up to Mount Palomar.
Oh, yes.
Up to the observatory at the top. And, and I drove up that thinking, I wish I was in an Alfa.
Yeah, the road up from the coast, Highway 76, there's a lake above that, Lake Henshaw. That's my favorite road. If I'm going out for a Sunday drive, that's where I start. Because on a Sunday morning or early on a Saturday morning, there are no cars up there. So up through to where you go to Mount Palomar, I will continue on. And then there's areas up there to an area called Mesa Grande, which is where the hardcore drivers go, because there's a lot of switchbacks, and then you hit the top. It's fairly straight, and then you're down the other side. And that's a very fun drive. I actually like to do that in my Fiat, my Abarth, more than the GTV6.
So which Abarth have you got?
It's a 2015. I think the European equivalent is a 595.
Okay. Yeah. Wonderful. So one of the things that I get to do, which is one of the great privileges of this job that I do, is we have an organization in the UK called the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, which represents car sales and car manufacturers. And they take over one of the big test centres in the UK at Millbrook. And all the manufacturers come and bring their cars along for people to play with. And they have a 4 mile long, I think, bowl that you can go up to 110 miles an hour, I think, at the top of it, and take your hands off the wheel and the car will run through. But they have an alpine course in the middle. And one of the best experiences I've had, I've driven lots of stuff on there, Porsche Taycans, but I drove a 695 SSA and went around the alpine course, got straight out of that and went into the electric 500 and did the same course. And both of them were just a hoot to drive around. It was just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I bought the Abarth not on a whim, but I needed to retire the Alfa because I was commuting probably 30 miles a day, but it was on freeways and the traffic got so bad. I needed something a little more commuter-like, but I didn't want to settle for a little Japanese box. A friend of mine who was working at the Alfa Fiat dealer said, well, we just got an Abarth in. The guy bought it the year before and was waiting till the 4Cs came. And his 4C was delivered. And he said, do you want to try this one out? So I went and test drove it. And then he said, well, he put about $10,000 worth of modifications into this. So there's no warranty on this Fiat. And I said, that's a no deal for me. But he said, I have another one that you might be interested in. So I hopped into that one and I said, okay, this is the one I want. And I've driven that car every day. I have 135,000 miles on it now. And I just love that car. I want to go out for a weekend drive or a short drive. I just go and it just drives around town, no problem.
I almost got my wife into an Abarth. So she has a Fiat 500, a 1.2 litre pop, I think they call it, which is bright yellow. And that's the thing she loves about it the most. And they don't do yellow 500s anymore. But until quite recently, they still did yellow Abarths. And I showed her a picture of a bright yellow 695 and said, would you replace your 500 with that? Somewhat selfishly. And she said, oh, that looks really nice. And then she noticed that it was a Biposto, so it had no rear seats. And it was £80,000, which is what at the moment about $115,000 or something. So she decided that wasn't a suitable replacement for her 15-year-old 500. So we're stuck with that. So again, on your podcast, we talked about my view of the future of Stellantis, or the future of Alfa Romeo under Stellantis. What's your perspective?
As you are, when you said you're optimistic, I've always been an optimist, but I've always also been a bit cynical about large corporates and their public relations. I am hopeful that they'll bring out a car that would be popular enough that it can keep them in the market in the U.S. As we spoke about, Alfa was popular for a long time here in the U.S. And then in the mid-90s, they weren't bringing anything new out. So their sales just dropped off a cliff and they left. So for 20 odd years, we had no Alfas here. We were very hopeful when they announced that they were coming back. We gobbled up the Giulias and the Stelvios. As we saw, they were very popular with the younger, newer owners, but it really didn't generate interest in joining the club. So we were pounding on administration through every means possible. Hey, bring us an enthusiast car too. We know that there is an underserved market for cars like this. I mean, we just look at Porsche with the Boxster and the Caymans, and they did so well with those. And of course, Miatas were always very big. The MX-5, the BMWs were very popular. There's a market here if you want to come and take it. But they didn't, despite all their promises. So we've gotten as I've said, I've gotten very cynical but hopeful. Every time they say we're coming out with a new model, it's like, please tell us you're bringing something. We're happy that we have the Quadrifoglio and the Quadrifoglio Verdes. We have a lot of club members who have purchased them. They change hands between club members as well. So they've gotten very good reviews. The changing of hands initially from FCA to Stellantis, we didn't think that was going to go very well. And I think that turned out to be what we were afraid of. But now that they've changed administration again, with an Alfa guy in charge, maybe we can go somewhere. So we're at the highest levels of our owners club. We have an avenue of communication directly to marketing and to some extent to the executive offices in Michigan. So we're always exchanging information about what we as owners want, and they come back and say, well, we think we're going to be able to do that.
And we talked on when we had this conversation the last time about Santo Ficcioli, who now heads up Alfa and Maserati. But of course, there's a lot of excitement about Antonio Filosa taking over from Tavares as CEO of Stellantis, and Italian heritage and an FCA guy pre-merger. I think my only concern about Filosa is he's a Jeep guy, really. Most of his FCA career was with Jeep rather than with the Italian brands. I think he did spend some time with Fiat, didn't he? So I'm less excited about the obvious signs from the very top. But I mean, we ran a podcast not long after the merger, and we were quite excited on the basis that if you discount Maserati, who are in a niche of their own, you've then got a whole slew of brands which are almost interchangeable. So in Europe, you've got Fiat, Citroën, Peugeot, Opel, Vauxhall in the UK, which is just an Opel with a budgie nailed onto the front of it. And I think most customers historically, they'd be happy with any of those and don't really see much differentiation between them. In France, there is a Peugeot Citroën divide. You're either one or the other. It's a kind of GM Ford thing, but not anywhere in the rest of Europe. And then you've got Alfa, which sits in that Mercedes, BMW, Audi niche, and they've got nothing else in that space. And you think, if I was in charge of Stellantis, that's the brand I'd put the money into, because I can't differentiate myself at the low end. Maserati is always going to be a small player just because of the price point, but I have a brand here that in theory doesn't compete with any of my other brands and is the biggest volume, highest margin sector of the market. The only new entrant, arguably, that you've had in that space in the last 20 years, and it is debatable, is Tesla. It's certainly in Europe, Tesla kind of competes with those three German brands, albeit with an audience that wants full electric. And they just seem to have dropped that ball completely and still not figured out what to do with the brand.
Yeah, I agree. From the American perspective, we've always thought of it as a sporty brand to compete with Audi, at least. Not sure that we thought of it as a true competitor to Mercedes because of the price points and the focus that Mercedes has always put on themselves. But, certainly an above average luxury brand with a sporting history is where we always felt that was the niche for Alfa. And we thought that was going to be the target market for them here in the US. And to an extent it was, but they never really followed up with it much.
It's interesting because I think we have a slightly different perception of Mercedes certainly in the UK and possibly in Europe. And I don't think they are that differentiated from Audi and BMW. And the place you most often see Mercedes is at airports dropping off passengers at airport terminus. So I always disparagingly refer to them as the Stuttgarter taxi fabric.
Right.
And if I see a Mercedes, my natural inclination is to stick my hand up and see if I can hail a ride. But I know they do have a lot of very expensive models in the range as well.
That's a big difference between the US and the European markets, because as you were saying, the Mercedes diesel was the thing you thought about as the taxi in Europe everywhere, where the diesel in the US was at the bottom of the line.
Right.
Everybody thought of Mercedes as the 280 or the S class in the US. And that's what they sold to here was the upper echelon of the income.
It is an amazing brand, though, because, again, this is more true in Europe than in the US, but it's true with you guys as well. They managed to sell very expensive luxury cars and vans in the same class as a Sprinter and trucks. And we have lots of buses and coaches and things which are Mercedes powered. But having all of those commercial vehicles doesn't seem to diminish the value of the brand for exclusive road cars, which is a hell of a trick to pull off.
Yeah, we see their vans here all over. Yeah.
Yeah. And they aren't, they're slightly more expensive than a Ford, but they're not hugely more expensive. It's quite the trick. Because the other fear we always have, which you don't have, is we're always looking over our shoulders because right-hand drive volumes for Alfa are really low worldwide. There's effectively the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. That's pretty much it. Malaysia and Singapore, but they're a handful of cars. In fact, I think the last Singapore dealers just closed down. So we're always waiting for them to say volumes of right-hand drive are insufficient for us to do the engineering to do the conversion. Mm. Well, I guess with you guys, it's more making them comply with US regulations, which I think have become harmonized enough that it's a smaller job than it was when they pulled out in the 90s, for example.
Right. Yeah, well, it was, I think, crash regulations as well as air quality, which was a big factor. At least that's what they say.
I always remember the Busso being terminated because of its emissions. It couldn't meet the Euro 4 or 5 emissions regulations. And then, and parts of this story are apocryphal, but if you bought a 939 series car, a Spider or a Brera or a 159 with the V6, that V6 was built in a factory in Australia by Holden, was shipped complete to Brazil, where the head was removed. A head and induction system that were made in Italy had also been shipped to Brazil, and they were mated at a GM factory in Brazil. The engine was then crated up and sent to Italy, where it was put in a car, which was then put on a ship and shipped back to Australia. And apparently, that was more eco-friendly than keeping the Busso. And even if the Brazil bit, which I can't find a good source on, even if the Brazil bit's not true, shipping the engines from Australia to Italy and then back again was already insane.
Yeah. You can just imagine when nowadays the environmentalists talking about the carbon footprint of all of that. It's like, well, there's no way that you'd be able to say that engine saved in carbon, taking into account all of the shipping and all of that. So it was
we're in danger of getting terribly off track. But do you know who came up with the term carbon footprint?
No.
It was BP. So the whole idea of measuring your carbon footprint was a marketing campaign that BP came up with to shift the blame for emissions from them to you. So it's not our fault that we sell oil. It's your fault that you use too much of it. It's genius. And it was a nice KPI for the environmental movement to latch onto. So they did, but they were kind of duped into it.
So the other collectible that I've gotten into are miniatures, miniature Alfas. And that's become quite an obsession, trying to find the models that I've owned as well as
in the colors that you own them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So I didn't mention that one because the others are much more expensive. But yeah, I have a reasonably large collection of mostly 1/43rd, but I have a 1/18th scale version of my Spider, which is nice, and now the Tonale in Montreal green, all the way down to Hot Wheels and Matchbox versions. In fact, if you're in the UK Club Facebook page, I just posted, I got from a Kickstarter project, I got a 1/64th scale wind tunnel.
Oh,
so I can now put my Hot Wheels and
smoke trails. Yes, I saw that.
So my 6-year-old grandson absolutely fascinated by it. Wants to put Teslas in it for some reason, but we'll cure him of that.
Yeah. I think the last thing I want to say is I finally got a 1/10 scale of the GTV6. I've been looking everywhere for one. And one of my good friends, members who goes to Italy annually or more than annually, finally, he said, well, I had asked for him to look for one at the museum store. And he said they didn't have one. but he found one in a shop in the village, and he hand carried it back for me.
Fantastic.
So I owe him big time for that.
Well, I'm trying to decide now, because I got an email today from BBR, who made my 18th scale Tonale. They've just announced pre-orders for an 18th scale new style 33 Stradale.
Wow.
Which is a mere 449 euros, which sounds a lot of money, but compared to 2.7 million euros or whatever the official unpublished number for buying a real 33 Stradale is and they are making more than 33 of them. It's limited edition, but more than the real one.
Oh, okay. I was just going to ask if there was going to be a limited number.
Yeah, I think it's not many more. I think it's 50 or something. There's a 143rd scale version as well, which is a mere 190 euros. Brilliant. I hope you enjoyed that. If you haven't yet listened to the mirror image interview, the link is in the show notes, or you can go straight to buzzsprout.com/2404040. We'll be back in 4 weeks' time on Sunday, August the 3rd, with a preview of National Alpha Day at Bicester Heritage. Episode 111 will be available to download from 1:30 p.m. from the club's website, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Until then, stay safe.